Michael Faulkender has an amazing resume. He's a finance professor at the University of Maryland, former Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Economic Policy, and now Chief Economist for the America First Policy Institute, AmericaFirstPolicy.com. Mike, it's great to have you on the Scott Sands Show.
It's great to be with you, Scott. Thanks for having me.
This popped up in one of my prep sources as I was getting ready for the show earlier today. 43 years ago today, 1981. Can you guess what the U.S. national debt was 43 years ago?
Oh, we were probably just eclipsing $1 trillion, I would guess.
That's exactly right. It's when it hit $1 trillion 43 years ago today. Now our national debt, $36 trillion. That's a 36 followed by 12 zeros if you were educated in Mississippi like me. That's almost like real money, right, Mike?
It is almost real money. That's when we start to hopefully pay attention around here that maybe we ought to do something about our unsustainable debt situation.
What is the national debt situation, the national debt crisis doing as far as the impact on the consumer economy today?
Well, so this year, I don't know if your viewers know it, the second largest item in the budget these days is debt service, or the interest that we pay on the debt. It is now more than we spend on Medicare. It is now more than we spend on the Pentagon. It is second only to Social Security. So as you think about the ability of the U.S. economy and the U.S. government to meet its obligations, the second highest expenditure is just paying for all the debts that have been accumulated up to now. It says nothing about the ability to actually fund current requirements. So that's going to tend to crowd out some of the other activities that you may want government to do. And not only that, it's going to require that a significant portion of tax receipts go merely towards paying the debts that previous generations and previous Congresses refused to pay for. So it's really setting up our kids and our future for some difficult financial decisions, because those obligations, that debt that has accumulated needs to be addressed.
I mean, to put this in terms that we have to face every day, this would be akin to paying more for our credit card debt personally than we're paying for our mortgage or for food or for medical care.
That's about right. Yeah. So think about your second largest expenditure and imagine if that is just merely interest on the debt that you owe. It's not even principal payments. It's just the interest.
I'm somewhat disgusted, flabbergasted that neither candidate, and this has been true for the last 8 years or more, really have not been talking about the national debt crisis at $36 trillion and growing on a daily basis, because it's something that we as a country should face. And at some point, we're going to have to make some hard decisions about how we spend our tax money.
We really are. And so it's something that I've had an opportunity to testify to Congress about. When I was Assistant Secretary, I chaired the working group that wrote the annual trustees reports for both Social Security and Medicare, and we have talked for decades. We have known, I remind people all the time, back in 1997 when I applied to graduate school, that was the year President Clinton said to Congress, save Social Security first. And we have done nothing in the 27 intervening years. And so every year when we write that trustees report to Congress, we say, the sooner that you address the long-term fiscal challenges confronting the nation, the less onerous the changes are going to have to be. And the problem is that the leaders that we have, unfortunately, on a bipartisan basis, they would rather tell people you don't have to do anything now rather than say you have to take a small reduction now or you have to face a small tax increase now in order to avoid a much larger one in the future. Unfortunately, we as Americans tend to reward politicians who just kick the can down the road.
Right.
And so when you give them a choice between raising taxes now, cutting spending now, or engaging in more debt, there has been a bipartisan decision to go the debt route.
Unfortunately, there's no clear solution other than an increase in taxes and a cutting of expenditures at this point. And you talk about kicking the can down the road. I mean, we haven't had a budget in I don't know how many years. It's been at least 10 years and 30 plus years since we've had anything close to a balanced budget. This is at some point in your family household, if your income has gone down and your expenses have gone up, you got to take a hard look at what you're spending money on and say, okay, I can do without that daily Starbucks. I'll buy my own coffee and grind it every day. You've got to make those tough decisions, but Social Security and taxes are the third rail of American politics.
Well, and I think to President Trump's credit, what his, the view that he has taken is that before you can have any kind of discussion about promises like Medicare and Social Security, why are we forgiving $500 billion in student loans? Why are we spending $1 trillion on green corporate welfare that the Democrats called the Inflation Reduction Act? Why are we spending all of this money on a federal bureaucracy when more than 90% of them don't come to the office on a full-time basis? I mean, before any politician, I think, has the credibility to talk about some of our structural problems, there's an obligation for policymakers to go in and really clean up a lot of the waste and the abuse that's going on in our spending programs, because only then will you have the credibility to say, oh, and we also need to do something about these long-term programs.
Mike Faulkender here on the Scott Sand Show, Chief Economist at the America First Policy Institute, AmericaFirstPolicy.com. If you're listening to the two presidential candidates, Mike, if you're listening to Donald Trump, he wants to make sure to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. He's talking about cutting corporate tax rates. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris wants to increase corporate tax rates, increase taxes on the wealthy, increase taxes on unrealized capital gains. Basically, I mean, let's be honest. If Kamala Harris wins and put a 100% income tax and a 100% corporate tax rate in place, it wouldn't have any major impact on the national debt. But what do their two tax plans mean for the economy?
You're right, because we have had in the history of our nation, since if you go all the way back to World War II, Scott, we've had tax rates as high as 70%. We've had tax rates as low as 28% for the top earners. And for that massive range from 28 to 70, you bring in about the same percentage of national income in the form of taxes. And that's because as you increase the rate, you get reductions in economic activity and you get ways that people figure out how to shield their income from the taxation. And so we've got this remarkably steady revenue stream that comes in to the federal government. It's averaged around 17.5% of national output. And yet we've been spending 20 up until the pandemic. We're currently spending about 23 to 24%. And that's the big problem, is that we've got this huge gap between 24% of national output being spent by the federal government and only about 17.5 coming in. And so, yes, you could raise tax rates. And like you said, do the thought experiment, raise tax rates to 100%. How much do people work if they get to keep none of the income? How are people going to allocate their wealth if no matter what they do, they're not going to be able to generate any return from investing that money? They're just going to shield it and they're going to stop working. And so there's this is what's known as the Laffer curve. This is why President Trump gave Art Laffer the Presidential Medal of Freedom, is explaining to people that if you put too high of a tax rate on things, you actually reduce economic activity and actually reduce federal tax receipts by more than if you had just left them alone. And so Kamala Harris has these grand ideas that we can massively grow government and have all of this money paid for by taxing the wealthy, when in fact we have decades of history that show us that they're going to receive nowhere near the amount of income that would cover all of this spending.
So if Donald Trump wins and we see tax cuts, sure, the wealthy will also receive tax cuts, but all of us will get a tax cut along the way. And as a result of that, spending in the country goes up. The national revenue increases with that as well. And we're all better off because we have more of our own money to keep and spend at our own discretion.
That's right. And also, if you look at the most recent IRS statistics, they put it out with about a year and a half lag or something like that. So we're talking about like 2022 numbers. But the top 1% made approximately 26% of the income and paid 46% of the income taxes. When Joe Biden and Kamala Harris tell you that the top 1% are not paying their fair share, they're right. They're paying a lot more than their fair share. They made 26% of the income and paid 46% of the income taxes. So the wealthy are paying a lot. But the problem is there is nowhere near enough among just merely the wealthy to cover all of this spending. So when they talk about how they don't want to tax anybody over $400,000, realize that they don't want to inflation adjust that over time. And anybody who's currently making $100,000, a couple decades from now, that'll be $400,000 merely because of inflation, but they'll call you wealthy. And so it's really a stealth tax on the middle class when they talk about it, because if they were honest, that $400,000 from 4 years ago should be $480,000 today, because we've had 20% inflation, and they're still stuck on they're still stuck on 400,000. Why? Because they're going after the middle class, because they know that's where the money is.
And if corporate tax rates go up, that's going to be passed along to us as consumers, as well as another hidden tax on all of us, because corporations have that obligation to their shareholders to maintain a profit margin, to continue reporting their quarterly earnings. They're going to pass that expense and added taxes along to us as well.
That's right. And so we saw that with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We took the rate from 35% down to 21%. And a couple of years later, we saw that from 2016 through 2019, there was a $7,000 increase on an inflation. After accounting for inflation, there was a $7,000 increase in the incomes of the median households. So a lot of that got passed along in the form of higher wages and lower prices, whereby it was the middle class, your average Americans, who benefited from it. Because just as higher tax rates are going to get passed along to consumers, lower corporate tax rates facilitate more employment and lower prices, and so it does get passed on. There's plenty of academic literature about who actually pays the corporate income tax. And as you said, it's not really the shareholders paying the vast majority of it. It gets passed along in the form of higher prices and lower wages, because there are these other counterparties that are going to end up having to bear some of it.
Mike, you break it down in a way that even I can understand, and I appreciate that.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Michael Faulkender, he's the chief economist at the America First Policy Institute, americafirstpolicy.com. Mike, can we find you on social media? Where are you?
We're at A1 Policy. So at A1 Policy, you'll find myself and all of the other people that are working to put America first when it comes to policy making in Washington.
Great to have you on. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.